At 11:40 p.m., on the night of December 29, 1944, a heavy sense of dread filled the cramped cockpit at Murray Field. Muro, Major Carroll C. Smith, 26 years old, a seasoned combat veteran with 43 missions and 4 confirmed kills, was intently studying the radar screen. Outside, the pitch-black skies north of the Philippine archipelago were the stage for a brutal assault. 12 Japanese bombers were inbound, closing at a speed of 180 knots. Muro Airfield was more than just a strip of land. It was the key. American engineers were racing against time to build 2 runways to support the imminent amphibious landing at Lingayen Gulf. If U.S. fighters could operate from Muro, they could shield the entire invasion force. The Japanese understood this. For 2 straight weeks, they had attacked Muro every night, an unrelenting barrage, marked by 334 air raid alerts. They sent anything that could carry explosives, conventional bombers, kamikazes, whatever was available. The objective was simple: force the Americans to halt construction. The pressure on Major Smith and the 418th Night Fighter Squadron was unbearable. Smith's squadron was the only barrier between those bombers and the 20,000 American troops sleeping in tents below. Every bomb that slipped through meant dead engineers, delayed runway construction, and rising casualties at Lingayen Gulf. Smith's aircraft, the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, was something entirely new, something the Japanese had never encountered. With a 66-foot wingspan and powered by 2 formidable Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines, each producing 2,000 horsepower. It was the first American aircraft designed from the ground up specifically for night combat. Its top speed reached 366 miles per hour, yet its most terrifying weapon was not the 420mm Hispano M2 cannons mounted in the belly. It was the SCR-720 radar housed in the nose. This system could detect aircraft at distances of up to 5 miles in total darkness. The Japanese had nothing like it. They flew at night believing the darkness would conceal them. They were wrong. Seated behind Smith was Lieutenant Philip Porter, his radar operator. Porter stared at the glowing scope, interpreting the echoes of every aircraft within range. The problem that night was brutally simple. 1 P-61 against 12 bombers. If Smith destroyed even a single target, 11 would still break through to bomb the airfields. The math was merciless. Even if he shot down 3 or 4, the rest would still complete their mission. Smith had trained for 18 months for this moment. Radar interception procedures, night navigation, gunnery practice, in absolute darkness. His unit had flown its first combat mission in November 1943, but the P-61 seconds themselves did not arrive until September 1944. The Black Widow was stable, powerful, and most importantly, its radar worked. However, radar could not solve the problem of numbers that night. Smith's fuel was sufficient for only about 3 hours of flight. If he spent 10 minutes dealing with each target, he could intercept just 3 bombers before being forced to return to base. 9 would get through. 9 meant hundreds, possibly thousands of casualties if they struck fuel depots or ammunition stores. At 11:42 p.m., Porter's voice came over the intercom. He had 4 distinct targets on the scope, all heading south toward Muro, at different altitudes. Smith had to make a decision which target to pursue first, and whether attempting to intercept all 4 in a single night was an act of brilliance or suicide. Smith pushed the throttles forward. The 2 R-2800 engines responded instantly. The Black Widow surged upward, climbing at 2,000 feet per minute. Porter called out vectors: heading 035, altitude 8,000 feet, range 4 miles. Smith could see nothing but absolute darkness. No moon, no stars, thick cloud cover blotting out everything. This was exactly why the Japanese had chosen this night. Total darkness rendered their bombers invisible to conventional fighters, but Smith was flying an aircraft that was anything but conventional. The CR-720 radar used a rotating parabolic dish mounted in the nose, transmitting microwave pulses forward. Porter monitored both radar displays, one for azimuth, left, right, and one for elevation, up, down, and guided Smith with verbal corrections: left 5 degrees, down 3 degrees. First kill. When the range closed to 3 miles, Smith activated his own radar display, a smaller screen integrated into the instrument panel. At 2 miles, Smith identified the target, a Mitsubishi G4M, known to the Americans as the Betty. The Betty had a fatal weakness. It lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. A single burst from Smith's guns would turn the bomber into a fireball. The Betty's crew had no idea Smith was closing in from behind. Japanese bombers carried no tail warning radar. They flew in darkness, believing themselves safe. Smith closed to 1,000 yards. He still could not see the Betty. He was flying entirely on radar. At 500 yards, Smith finally saw it, a dark shape silhouetted against slightly less dark clouds. The flames from the bomber's engine exhausts were only a faint orange glow. Smith maneuvered the P-61 into position, slightly below and behind the bomber. The 4 forward-firing 20mm cannons were fixed. He had to aim the entire aircraft. He adjusted his position until the Betty sat squarely in the gun sight. At 350 yards, Smith fired. The burst lasted 2 seconds, 48 20mm explosive rounds. The Betty's right wing exploded. Fuel ignited instantly. The bomber rolled to the right and plunged downward. Smith watched it fall. It struck the water 8 miles north of Muro. At 11:57 p.m., 1 bomber destroyed. But Smith's fuel gauge now showed that 15% of his fuel was gone. 3 targets still remained on Porter's scope, and Smith had exactly 112 minutes of fuel left. The relentless pursuit. Porter acquired the second target at 12:14 a.m. on December 30, heading 180, altitude 6,000 feet, range 6 miles. Smith turned the P-61 south and descended. The problem now was geometry. The second bomber was 23 miles from the site of the first kill. With the Black Widow's cruising speed of 280 miles per hour, Smith had roughly 5 minutes to intercept. 5 minutes was more than enough time for the bomber to close dangerously on Muro. Smith pushed the Black Widow faster, up to 320 miles per hour. At this speed, the R-2800 engines consumed fuel at an alarming rate. Every minute at maximum power could cost 3 minutes of patrol time. But without a rapid intercept, the bomber would reach the target area. American anti-aircraft guns would open fire, and whether the aircraft was shot down or not, its bombs could still be released. At 12:19 a.m., as Smith closed in, he identified the target, another Betty. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind it. At 500 yards, he could see the Betty clearly, still flying straight and level, its crew completely unaware of Smith's presence. He fired a 2-second burst. The shells ripped through the Betty's fuselage. Both engines caught fire within seconds. The bomber plunged into the sea. 2 down, fighting the tough Helen. Smith's fuel gauge now read 42%. Porter still had 2 targets, both closer to Muro than the previous ones, one at 9,000 feet, the other at 4,000 feet, 8 miles apart. Smith chose to prioritize the higher target. Climbing consumed less fuel than a rapid descent. The P-61 reached 9,000 feet at 12:23 a.m., but this third target was different. It was a Nakajima Ki-49 Donryu, known to the Americans as the Helen, faster than the Betty, better defended, and most critically, performing continuous evasive maneuvers, turns, altitude changes. Clearly, its crew knew American night fighters were in the air. To avoid fire from the Helen's tail gunner, Smith altered his approach. He attacked from below and to the left, exploiting a blind spot in the Japanese bomber's defenses. Porter had to anticipate the Helen's erratic movements, constantly adjusting Smith's vectors. At 375 yards, the Helen's tail gunner opened fire. Tracers streaked past Smith's cockpit. The element of surprise was gone. Smith had only seconds before the bomber's pilot could execute even more violent evasive action. He squeezed the trigger. A 3-second burst, 72 rounds, longer than previous bursts, necessary because the Helen was maneuvering. The 20mm shells tore into the fuselage. The right engine exploded. The bomber flipped inverted and spiraled down. At 12:29 a.m., 3 destroyed, survival limits and the 4th kill. Smith's fuel gauge dropped to 28%, dangerously low. Most pilots were required to return to base at 30%. Porter still had one final target on the scope, the low-flying aircraft at 4,000 feet that Smith had previously bypassed, now only 12 miles from Muro. Smith dove. A dive conserved fuel. He leveled off at 4,200 feet, slightly above the target. At 12:34 a.m., Smith attacked the final Betty. The bomber was flying straight toward Muro, making no evasive moves. Smith checked his ammunition, 512 rounds remaining. Fuel, 23%. If he missed, there would be no fuel for a second pursuit. Smith fired, a 2-second burst. The 20mm shells converged into the center of the Betty's fuselage. The bomber's left wing tore away. It slammed into the ocean at 12:35 a.m. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes, a decision that could not be abandoned. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Muro. Fuel, 21%. He was 18 miles from the airfield. Porter swept the radar. The remaining 8 bombers had turned back. The mission was complete. But at 12:42 a.m., Porter detected a new target, flying north at 7,000 feet. Its position lay between Smith and base. If it was Japanese, it was heading toward the very airfields Smith had just defended. Engaging would burn more fuel, possibly too much. But allowing a Japanese aircraft to approach Muro unchallenged after downing 4 bombers would taint the entire effort. Smith turned toward the contact. At 800 yards, Smith identified the target. It was not a bomber, but a Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate the Frank, faster and more maneuverable than the P-61. But the Frank had no radar and was flying blind. Smith closed from below and behind. Fuel, 17%. He pulled the trigger. A 3-second burst, 72 rounds. The longest of the night. The shells shredded the Frank's tail and engine cowling. The engine burst into flames. The pilot bailed out. 5. Aircraft, destroyed. The journey home, and a miracle. Smith checked his fuel. 15%, just enough to reach Meguiar Field, with the barest reserve. At 12:52 a.m., Smith sighted the runway lights. 12 dim points marking a 5,000-foot crushed coral runway. He began his descent. At 12:55 a.m., the runway lights went out. Everything vanished into absolute darkness. Smith was 3 miles from the runway, at 800 feet. With no lights, Smith had no visual references. He had only one option: land at Meguiar Field, without runway lights, relying on radar altitude and dead reckoning navigation. The smallest error would mean slamming into jungle, coral rock, or construction equipment. Fuel remaining, 9%. Smith approached at 110 knots, faster than normal, but necessary to reach the ground before the tanks ran dry. At 12:59 a.m., the P-61 seconds main wheel struck the crushed coral. The impact was harder than usual, but the landing gear held. Smith braked hard until the Black Widow rolled to a complete stop. Fuel gauge, 6%. Major Carroll, C. Smith had carried out 5 intercepts, 5 victories in just 55 minutes, followed by a perilous blind landing. He and Lieutenant Porter had saved the lives of the soldiers sleeping below, protected the airfield, and ensured that the Lingayen Gulf landing went ahead on schedule. The following afternoon, Smith and Porter took off again and shot down another Frank fighter. 7 confirmed victories in less than 24 hours made Smith the leading American night fighter ace of World War II. A remarkable achievement, a triumph of courage and technology over the darkness. Thank you for watching the entire video. Wishing you a wonderful day.